Hello, and welcome to this special hour with two of our favorite thriller writers, Lee Child and Michael Connelly. My name is Louisa Smith, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Mysterious Press, buying director for Book Passage Bookstore, and the very lucky host of today's event. I'd first like to thank all of you for being here. We know you have lots of options for how to spend your time, so thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. Book Passage has a robust events program, both in-store and online, in no small part due to supporters like you. I hope you will have a chance after today's event to visit our website and see who else is coming. Today, though, we are celebrating the newly released short story collection from Lee Child, titled Safe Enough. Lee is well known for his best-selling Jack Reacher series, but he's also an absolutely brilliant short story author. These 20 intriguing, thrilling, and rapid-fire fictions are intimate portrait of humanity at its best and worst, sure to please new and longtime fans of Child and to illuminate a side of the author's work unknown to Reacher devotees. Joining in the conversation today is the man who called Lee the best thriller writer in the world, a writer who is also one of the best crime fiction authors in the world, and that, of course, is Michael Connelly. Michael is the author of 38 novels, including the beloved Harry Bosch series, and he will be presenting his latest work, The Waiting, a Ballard and Bosch novel, on Saturday, October 26th at 4 p.m. Pacific time, both in person at our Corte Madera location and online. There will be links to purchase Safe Enough and pre-order The Waiting in the chat today. Now, the best part of these events is the questions that you yourself ask, which we have sent to Lee and Michael. So we will look forward to hearing all of the wonderful conversation that they will have. Thank you, Lee and Michael, for being here.
A real pleasure. Thank you, Louisa.
And also, I'm very happy to be here as well. Lee and I go way back. It's kind of like almost like high school. Like we feel like we're in the same class. Came out in the mid '90s around the same time. Got to know each other early on in our careers and been friends for a long time. Here's the book I should hold up and what we're going to talk about. Lee, I was really taken with the foreword you wrote because it mirrored my own experiences with short stories. I think what happens is we say, hey, I want to be a writer and I want to write novels, and we're probably inspired by novels. And out of the gate, we write novels. And then one thing that happens if you have any modicum of success in writing a crime novel is you get requests for short stories, and they kind of like, it's kind of surprising at first, and then you kind of have to kind of relearn a little bit, and it is ironic. And I'm going to get to a question, but like I think I went down this path to becoming a crime novelist because of short stories. You know, reading Sherlock Holmes and reading Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, and then I kind of forgot about that and just thought about writing novels. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's exactly true in that a lot of what we read, especially as younger people, were short stories. And Sherlock Holmes was certainly one of them for me, and lots of others. Ruth Rendell, I would read. She was a great short story writer. But yeah, for me, becoming a novelist was a very late connection of two things. I was always a huge reader. Just loved reading. I loved that sensation of being immersed in a different world, being a different person at a different place, a different time of history. I just loved reading, but it was always novels, essentially. And when I started out writing, it was a panic for me and a rush because I was suddenly out of work and I needed to rescue my situation. And so I thought, having read so many novels, it's a very late epiphany. I just thought, I've loved these all my life. Could I try doing one? And so I was totally focused on that long form. And I never saw the connection between novels and short stories. And I was super surprised when somebody said, oh, you know, we loved your first book. Would you do a short story? It's a bit like, you know, you're a great center fielder and somebody says, that's great. Do you want to play goaltender in a hockey game? It just seemed to be a totally different thing. And I got to admit, my first ever short story was a Reacher short story. And that's the thing about this book. Safe Enough is a book of non-Reacher short stories. we did a book of Reacher short stories called No Middle Name. And that contained my very first ever, which was a kind of uncomfortable feeling because I was British and I had done that terribly unacceptable thing, which was to go to America to become successful in America. And the British establishment at every level hates that. You know, they think you should be home starving in a garret in London or something, suffering for your art. And to go to America and become a bestseller was kind of iffy for them. So that very first one I wrote as a kind of gesture or expiation to get them on my side in the British critical establishment. And it wasn't really a short story at all. It was part of my second novel that wasn't working, that I'd stripped out. And I thought, I had heard this piece of advice from some writer: never waste anything, never delete anything. Just cut it and store it in a separate file somewhere because it will be useful at some point. And when I was asked for this first short story, I thought, yeah, I can sort of squash this together and make it into a story, which I did. But then the decision became every time, because once you do it once, people keep asking you over and over again, to the point where you could be doing 10 or 20 a year. And so after that, the fundamental decision was always, should it be a Reacher short story or should it be non-Reacher? And I think probably the first non-Reacher one I did was the oldest one in this book, called The Snake Eater by the Numbers, which was, again, kind of set out for me. It was Karen Slaughter had put together this idea of what was essentially a serial novel. It was a bunch of people writing short stories, but they were very, very defined in terms of story. The idea of the book was that the book was called Like a Charm. And the idea of the book was that there was this woman's charm bracelet that was followed from the 19th century when it was first made all the way through the 20th into the 21st century, where it was. And I was not in that book originally, but somebody who was promised a story pulled out. So I got this panicked call from Karen saying, explaining the concept and saying, I've got a hole that I need to fill. And very specific, because the story before and the story after were already written. So there was this charm bracelet. I had to find it in a police evidence lockup in North London. And then a couple of days later, it had to be found inside the stomach of a corpse. And so Karen was talking to me on the phone, and I was rehearsing ways to say no, because I thought, because I'd asked her, when do you need this? And she said, like, tomorrow. So I was rehearsing ways to say no. And then suddenly in my head, I suddenly saw how I could do it. It just popped into my head. So I smoothly segued from being about to say no to be saying, sure, I can do that. And so that's the oldest story in this book, and one of the best, probably, I think, because after that very intense first few years of writing Reacher, finding my feet, dealing with all the things that come your way, it was a real relaxation to write about something different, under different pressures.
Yeah, I find that I'm reluctant to do short stories because I'm always writing a book, it seems, and so you have to put that aside. You have to stop your train of thought and your momentum to write a short story, and they're usually for some kind of charitable effort. But I do find when you're given a specific thing, it works better. And like one of your stories here was from a collection that I was involved in, where all the stories, I mean, your story here is called The Truth About What Happened. All the stories are inspired in some way by the paintings of Edward Hopper. And when Lawrence Block asked me to do that, that was the only one I never hesitated on. I said, yeah, I'll do that. And you kind of touched on that in your last question. So do you like it when the parameters are set for the story that you're being asked to write?
I really do, yeah. And I love to be given a theme, even if it's broad, because it's quite outfacing. You know, if somebody just says, write a story, and you've got a whole world of infinite possibilities, what are you going to do about that? Either you use an idea that you once had, or you're just a bit lost. But if somebody narrows it down, and that's a great example for two reasons, actually. Number one, if Lawrence Block asks you to do something, you're going to do it because, as you said, we came up basically in the same generation. But looking backward, we were seeing these titanic figures of the genre, Lawrence Block being one of them. And so if he says, will you write a story? Your instinct is to say, of course. But it was super helpful to have those narrow parameters. And if I look through this book, most of them were like that. You know, they all had a theme. A lot of them were either charity contributions or funding writers' organizations. That's the way that a lot of organizations do it. They publish often once a year an anthology that is showing off the work of the members of that organization, and whatever sales it gets, it funds the operation. And it's also good for promotion for the lesser known, because what they try and do is mix it up. You know, if you've got 20 stories in a book, 10 of them will be by big names and 10 of them will be by unknown names. The idea being that the people will buy the book because of the big names, and then they will be exposed to the smaller names and they'll get some promotion and publicity out of that, which is a great way of doing it. So yeah, a lot, and that really is the key to how I've deep down in the back of my brain feel about short stories, because prior to being a writer, I was in TV like you were a journalist. And I think we probably both had the same deep down feeling, which was that you've got an audience out there that you're writing for. And if you're doing well, you get big ratings and good money. That's the basic showbiz transaction. But short stories, we almost always give away, or else it's a very nominal fee, you know, like a couple of $100. So in the sort of animal part of my brain in the back, I had this strange equation. Zero money meant nobody was reading them. It seemed to be an obvious conclusion. And so that liberation was fantastic as well, because there is a certain amount of pressure with your series. When you've got a book a year, each one has got to carry some weight, and you do worry about how people are going to receive it. But if you think nobody's reading these short stories, then the liberation is even more intense. You can do what you want.
Yeah, you're not only very prolific in your short stories. This is a second volume, as you said, and there's probably enough for more. But you also have been the guy, the editor, the guy who puts these collections together several times. And that is a tough job to do. I've done it a couple times and I don't want to do it anymore, because you're the guy asking people to, hey, stop forward momentum on your project that you make your living from, and give me a short story. And but you seem to say yes a lot. So what has that experience been for you when you're the editor and you're putting these together?
You're right. I mean, it's an awkward feeling, isn't it? Because if I'm asked by somebody, my feeling is always, yeah, be cooperative, be helpful, contribute, because everything is a two-way street. You know, I've received fantastic support and warmth and inclusion from the genre community as a whole. And I'm sure you would feel the same. And so when we're asked to give something back, we naturally would like to. But it can be a bit of an intrusion. And so when I'm asking other people, I'm very aware of that. You know, I know exactly how they're going to feel. They open that email and they think, oh, God. And they probably don't want to do it, but they will do it because of a general commitment to the community, plus also a personal commitment to me because we're friends or whatever. And so I'm very reluctant really to ask people, because I know that in the real world, they're not going to say no, and they are going to take on that burden. And it is a little intrusive. For me personally, I've always put it off. When I have to write one, I put it off, and I usually do it the night before deadline, which in a way is laziness and a sort of aversion thing. But in a way, it's really helpful too, because you write with such a burst of energy and passion, and because it's short, it can be completely organic from beginning to end, made up on the spot, and it can work. Whereas you can't do that with a novel, obviously, because you do have to take daily breaks, weekly breaks, and so on. It's a months-long process, not just a day's work.
Yeah, I have to admit that when I was asked to do an anthology of short stories for Mystery Writers of America, you were the first name I thought of because you're the man who always says yes. So you were my starting point. You know, then from you, I could say, hey, Lee Child's already doing one, and I would send the next email to the next person, and I would build the list. And you were very helpful that way, and I'm sure it's been that way with others. Let me ask you this: have you ever written a short story because you just wanted to write a short story, or was it always because of a request?
It's you know, that's a question that gets to the heart of what exactly is writing. I mean, numerous times I have daydreamed a substantial fragment of a story. You know, I've just sat there and thought, yeah, this could happen, that could happen. And I've got the nucleus of a story. And then I might just forget it and then immediately go on to the next one. So I've got a database of like 20 living ideas in my head. And then somebody asks for a story. And I think, all right, which one of those 20 ideas could be massaged into the correct form for this anthology? And so it's a mixture of the two. I mean, they're never written out on paper. They're never completed. They're never kind of proofread or anything like that. There's no manuscript, but there's an idea. And yeah, it's a question, which idea would fit best for whatever the theme of the anthology is?
Do you think you can be good at both, you know, writing long form and short form, or do you need to specialize like a George Saunders or a Doug Allen?
I think the evidence shows that you probably do need to be a specialist, because there are certain people that do fantastic short stories and are not known for their novels, and vice versa. So I think there is a definite split in terms of the skills. And I'm very aware that I don't think I've got those skills. You know, I'm not rubbishing these stories. I think they're all fine. I'm proud of them all, and I was satisfied, although otherwise I wouldn't have sent them in. And I'm not really a literary critic either, so I don't have the technique or the vocabulary to really analyze it. But to me, mine feel like very, very, very short novels. It seems to me that there is a thing in short stories, some kind of magical trick or reveal that suddenly pulls a rug out from under you or changes something that the real greats do so effortlessly. And I'm not sure I've ever got that far. I'm not sure what that secret trick is. So yeah, I think evidence shows, yeah, some people are really great at short stories and not so good at novels, and vice versa.
So writing short stories, I find it's a completely different approach from writing a long form, writing a novel. I find that plot has to come first in a short story, and then character. Whereas with the novel, at least I'm always thinking about the character. What am I gonna do with Harry Bosch? What are you gonna do with Reacher? That really comes first. And just curious if you have an opinion about that. Is that the same with you?
Yeah, it really is. Because I remember something that you said in a talk I heard years and years ago. The question was that traditional question, where do you get your idea for a book? And you made the point that it's not just an idea. A novel contains 3 or 4 ideas that have to be combining really well. It's like 3 or 4 atoms will merge to make a stable molecule, and that is the book. So it's a different process because imagining a novel is, you need 3 or 4 different strands, and you need a tone, and you need a flavor, and all of that kind of thing. Whereas with a short story, you can get away with one idea. It can be a one-trick story or a one-idea story. And so in that sense, you can use stuff that you're unable to use in a novel, something that's not quite durable enough for a novel, something that is in passing really fascinating, but over 400 pages, it couldn't survive. But over 20 pages, it can be great.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, it's almost like a chapter. I think in a novel, again, it's character driven, but you also have, you need and usually have many twists, maybe a twist a chapter. And in a short story, you can kind of get away with one twist. You know, you're heading one way and then suddenly it's this other thing. And then you can like get out of the story.
Yeah. The character is super important, and it gives you the opportunity to do a different character or different characteristics, because, you know, writing Reacher's always got to win. He's always got to dominate. He is the main figure that carries the justice in the story, and he's got to deliver at the end. And that is, I love it. That's fine. I'm not complaining about it. But the opportunity to write somebody who is maybe a bit of a wimp, or is not very good at his job, or is a failure, or is a criminal, there's a liberation and a freedom there that I've really enjoyed.
Yeah, so this collection is all non-Reacher stories. Did writing these stories, or I assume it did, so let's change that question to, how did writing these short stories without Reacher help you make Reacher a better series of novels?
I think by giving myself the putting myself in the position of being somebody else other than Reacher, because one thing that really interests me is something somebody said to me. That question we get, I'm sure you get it. How much of you is in Harry Bosch? Which is a really nice question. It's a benign question. They're saying, how much of you is in this very good and popular moral hero? And, you know, people say the same to me about how much of me is in Reacher, and they're saying, how much of you is in this tough guy with a heart of gold? And that's a lovely question. But equally, every bad guy that we write is us too. And every disgusting criminal or appalling sadist or whatever that we write, that's us too. And so I've found that the short stories, writing more compromised characters, weaker characters, nastier characters than would traditionally be the main hero in a thriller, it exercises different muscles. And so that when you come to write the next series book, maybe you're a little better at imagining the bad guy or the medium guy, you know, the compromised guy who doesn't really want to do it, but has been dragged into it. I think it gives you a wider range of empathy.
This might sound like an easy question, but I really think it's not. But which do you find is easier to write? A short story with Reacher in it, or a short story with someone completely new? You know Reacher like the back of your hand. I know Harry Bosch like the back of my hand, but I've always found it hard to write short stories about Harry Bosch because of the universe of knowledge I have about him. And so I have written short stories about Harry Bosch, but I tend to look for something else, or just take a day off from Harry Bosch and write something different.
Yeah, it's a great question, because what is easier? I think that, again, a lot of it is decided for me, because a lot of these requests are specifically for a Reacher story. Like last Christmas, a magazine in Britain wanted a Christmas short story, and specified, could it be Reacher? Because, you know, that sells better for them. And I felt that maybe I have it slightly easier than you because Reacher is so minimalist in terms of his life that it's plausible he could be anywhere doing anything. Whereas there would have to be a little bit of explanation with Harry Bosch. I mean, if Harry Bosch was suddenly in the woods in Maine or something like that, you would have to justify how that happened. Whereas with Reacher, it's perfectly natural that he would be there as much as anywhere else. So, and Reacher succeeds with glancing contact. The one that I did write last Christmas for that magazine is really about somebody else, and Reacher is almost a supporting character in the story. And that was an interesting way of doing it. The story is really about another guy, an intelligence officer from London who comes into contact with Reacher. And that was a nice way of doing it. It got both things in there. Reacher, just a glancing blow, just a glimpse of him, really not more than 5 minutes of conversation with him. But it roots it as a Reacher story, but it's fundamentally about a different context.
I got asked once to do a short story where they were not going to, they're going to list all the authors who contributed to this anthology, but they weren't going to put their name with the story. And the gimmick was, if you will, gimmick's probably the wrong word, but was you guess who wrote what. So I wrote a ghost story, and it's probably my favorite short story of all time because it was so different from what I do. Is there a story in this collection that hold it up here again, that people will be surprised that it was written by Lee Child?
I'm pretty sure that there's a couple of them. There's one called, there was one, again, it was for one of those writers' organization anthologies that was fundraising, and the theme was romance. The guest editor was Heather Graham, who, you know, tremendous romance and romantic suspense writer. So I felt I'm entering her world now, and I have no real clue how to do it. And so I did write one called I Heard a Romantic Story that I think is one single 2,500 word paragraph because it just the way it flowed out, very experimental in form. And I think people who read that would have no idea it was me writing it. Some of them are non-reachers, but very characteristic. I think some people would spot that it's me. Some of them, yeah, you know, going back to that earlier question about the specification, I'm looking through the list, and there was one, a horse racing anthology. Why I got involved with that, I've got no idea. But so what do I know about horse racing? What am I going to do? And so I came up with a good solution to that. And then there was a guy called Jonathan Santlofer who was doing anthologies about drugs, the cocaine chronicles, the marijuana chronicles, and then the nicotine chronicles, ultimately. Again, specified quite tightly the type of story. And I had a lot of fun writing those. There's one called Wet with Rain that was in that noir series, and this one went in Belfast noir. And my dad was from Belfast, so I'm considered a sort of honorary Northern Irish person, and they asked me to be in that. And the title of the story is Wet with Rain, which is a constant line in Van Morrison songs. So I had this idea of a house that had once been owned by an obscure writer, and some guys from America were coming. They wanted to buy the house to make it into a museum. And, you know, with that little specification, there's still plenty of room, and you can come up with a unique story. That's the nature of writing. I mean, and those anthologies are proof of that we all get the same spec going in, and you'll get 20 writers writing totally different stories, even though they're within the same spec. So it is, I like the guardrails of the specification, but I still find plenty of room for doing what I want to do.
You mentioned the Nicotine Chronicles, so that kind of segues into this one. Is is your actual physical writing process of a short story different from when you sit down each day to write the next pages of a novel? Is it still coffee and cigarettes no matter what you're doing, or what?
Yeah, coffee and cigarettes, no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm writing or not. And so it's much more the kind of weight on your shoulders when you sit down. When you sit down to do that day's work on the novel, you're aware that you're in this massive, long narrative where there's already a lot gone. You're doing what you're doing today, and there's a lot still to come. And subliminally, that seems to alter how I work. This thing in the back of your mind all the time about map it out. Don't necessarily do everything on this page because you're going to need something 20 pages from now. You have much more of a concept of a lot still to come. And with a short story, I just sit down and write it in one. Most of these stories were written in one take, in one session. And that is because I think I'm reacting to the fact that you don't have to save anything for later. It's all in that moment. And so it can be a lot more energetic, a lot faster. There can be a lot of passion in it. One burst of passion can power the whole story. Whereas in a novel, it can really only power one chapter or one strand of the novel, and the rest of it is still there to be done.
Now, I know that you are supposedly retired. You've passed the Reacher baton to your brother. But there's a couple questions that came in from the viewers, and they're pretty good. And I'm going to run this one by you. And it's a question, but maybe it's a plea. Do you think you ever want to revisit or expand on any of the stories and characters you created here in this book?
In this book?
Yeah.
Probably not, because I look at them as people that I've known briefly, and we all get this in real life. You go out somewhere, you spend half an hour talking to some random person that you've never seen before and you will never see again, and that has a kind of unique quality to it, that connection for that brief period of time. It has no prehistory. It has no obligations afterward. It is what it is for 30 minutes. And that's kind of how I feel about the short story characters, that I am in love with them while I'm writing the story. If it's going well, this is a great person and I'm loving the experience. But then when I finished it, I'm satisfied with having known that character. I don't necessarily want to carry on and do anything else with it.
Kind of related to that is another question that came in. There's a long history of short stories becoming great films, All About Eve, The Killers, Stephen King's, there's a bunch of Stephen King's things. Which of your short stories in this collection or anywhere else do you think would make a really good film?
Yeah, that's a good one too. And, especially after Reacher on Amazon Prime was a success, people were sniffing around to buy anything. And all the Reacher stuff was already contained in that contract, so they had to look at the non-Reacher stuff. And actually, all of these are sold. Somebody will buy any idea in the hope that maybe they'll make it one day. So different than publishing. Hollywood buys everything and makes virtually nothing. And publishing buys virtually nothing, but makes all of it. And so there's a very different dynamic. So which of them would be good for a movie? I think in principle, yeah, short stories as a whole are better bases for movies because the content density matches better. A movie is really a very short thing in terms of the actual, when it's reduced to words, when you see a screenplay, it's laid out in that famous old format with the font and that sort of typewriter font and the huge margins and the narrow little dialogue blocks. And it's laid out that way because years ago, decades ago, they calculated that a page of that format equals about a minute on screen. That's why they do it like that. And so when you look at that and you imagine it squashed up without all the big margins in it, there's probably about 35 or 40 pages of content, as opposed to 400 pages of content for a novel. So a short story, I think, wastes much less if it's made into a movie. And as you say, a lot of great movies were short stories. I think that that is an ideal connection. So I know Safe Enough, the actual story, as opposed to the title of the volume, that's been bought many times and attempted. Nobody's ever made it. But I think it needs slightly more than one episode. A lot of my stories illustrate one episode only, but something that has a longer timeline, like the story Safe Enough, I think that would make an interesting movie. And let's hope it gets made at some point.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Hollywood has always been this way, but really intensely in the last decade or so operates on IP. And so when you say they throw out a giant net and very few things are made, a project that has Lee Child's name attached to it has a better shot than others. And I think, so maybe we will see Safe Enough happen at some point. I'm kind of known for writing about LA. You have a guy in your Reacher series that travels the country, and in these short stories, you travel the world. So when you get asked to do one or you come up with an idea, what comes first? The where you want to set it, or what the plot is?
I mean, the delight for me is that, I live in America. I've been here more than quarter century, but I do not have that deep down connection with any one spot. I wasn't born here. I have no birthplace. There's no little town where I went to elementary school. There's no city where I went to college. There's no city where I had my first job. And so it's a level playing field, and it is on the field, the geography, the temperature, the season. That is the thing that always pops into my mind first. Is this a cold, gritty story, or is it a hot, sweaty story? And the location will emerge in my mind, and that tends to bring the characters with it, because characters and activities and schemes and scams do tend to be kind of geographically specific, somehow going with the weather or going with the landscape. Everything seems to be predicated on where. And so that is the first thing I decide. Yeah.
This is another mail-in question. Are there any short story authors that you read and recommend? In other words, that you got to read the next collection from George Saunders or Joyce Carol Oates or something like that?
Well, certainly Joyce. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm still trying to catch up, and a lot of them are dead by now. I mentioned Ruth Rendell, who is a very English novelist in their usual way, very fixed location geographically, either the countryside with the Wexford novels, or when she's writing as Barbara Vine, that area of North London that she writes about. But her short stories tend to be freer and more wide-ranging, and she does have a skill. In fact, there's one that it's driving me crazy because I can't find it now, but I remember reading it. It was a very poignant story about a guy who's going to visit his girlfriend because they've had a fight, and he gets on the bus and he heads over there and he does a number of things on his way. And then at the last minute, he decides he's not going to go see her because he's still mad at her. So he turns around and comes back. And that's how he spends his morning. And then she is discovered dead. And you suddenly realize that everything that he did in the morning looks super suspicious, even though it wasn't. That very neat reversal halfway through the story, where he had an innocent morning, now he's fighting for his life in the afternoon. I can't remember where I read it, and I'm desperately looking through all my books trying to find it. So I'm not a connoisseur, not an expert in short stories, so I enjoy them like any other reader. But they still mystify me a bit about how they're done, and certainly how they're done so well by the people that do it well.
Well, if someone's watching this and they know that story and can help you,
Yes,
hopefully,
please.
or they can comment on the YouTube underneath our interview here. Okay, so I got one last question. It's probably the most important question, or the one that our viewers here are most interested in. I mentioned the retirement and that your brother is very well taken on the Reacher series. I know you work with him on it, but and you've also said your process on short stories is to write them in a day. So can we see more short stories? Are we going to see anything more from Lee Child?
Yeah, retirement is an illusion. I mean, it just isn't happening. Part of that was due to the pandemic, that we had a sudden shutdown of everything, and the publishing trade and book trade were in dire straits. And so they invented the idea of these virtual events. And I felt uh, I felt keen to help out wherever I could. So I did loads and loads of those through the pandemic, and it sort of carried on. And simultaneously working on the Reacher TV with Amazon Prime, which was successful more than even they had hoped. And they went into this euphoria and commissioned me to write a short story for them. And so I did. So I just wrote that. So I'm sure that there will be constant little bits and pieces here and there, so that I'll still be around, but leaving Reacher to my brother, see how that goes. And there's a spin-off to Reacher now on Amazon, just been announced yesterday. So that that'll be more work. So I'm keeping my hand in the universe. I'll be around, but winding down. That's my new thing now. Winding down instead of saying retirement, because clearly retirement will never happen.
All right, well, I think you sound like you're lamenting that, but I think that's music to a lot of people's ears. So here's a book again. Thank you so much for spending some time with me and us watching. And we look forward to more from Lee Child. And I think Louisa is going to wrap us up here.
Thank you both so much. We've had the pleasure of having events with you many, many times over the years. And I have to say, every time it's something fresh and new. And I learned so much this time. I was just absolutely fascinated. Thank you for your generosity for being here today. Really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who's watching. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have links in the chat below for both Lee's book, Safe Enough, and for Michael's new book that is coming out very soon. And please join us on October 26th when Michael will be in the store and online to celebrate his book. Thank you, everybody.